Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you everybody far and wide across the motu for joining us today for the first Deep South Challenge seminar of 2019. It's taken us a little while to get started this year, nearly the end of February, but we're really happy to be here, and we're really happy to be leading with such a popular and important group of research projects. It's quite overwhelming that we have over 100 individuals joining us from both hubs and PCs and laptops across the country, from Dunedin to Kaitaia. And we really welcome all of our partners and stakeholders, and thank you for your interest in our research. This seminar was very widely advertised, slightly out of our control, so we think that the capacity for the room maxes out at 100. So if you're by any chance able to join a hub or a colleague down the corridor, we'd encourage you to do so that others can join the room. I think the interest in today's seminar indicates definitely the importance of this research and perhaps also its urgency. So I would like to welcome our two speakers, Lisa Ellis from Otago and Catherine Iorns from here at Victoria University at the government buildings. You may all be aware that Lisa Ellis's research report was released recently and very widely picked up in the media. So Lisa will be kicking off our seminar and speaking first. She'll also be speaking for slightly longer than Catherine. Catherine's research has yet to be released, and it's still in the peer review process. So we've asked Catherine just to, it's just good protocol, and also definitely built into Deep South Challenge's protocol that we always brief stakeholders before we release research, and that process has yet to begin. We'll be doing that over the next month or so before we release the research publicly. So, but we really thank Catherine for joining us today. Because of the complementary nature of these two research projects, we thought it would be a good opportunity. Just briefly a little bit about the format for the day. So Lisa will speak for about half an hour, Catherine will speak for about 10 minutes, and then there'll be 20 minutes for questions. The way to ask a question in this format, we have people in physical hubs, we have people connected via AV facilities and via their laptops. If you're on a laptop, you should be able to find in the chat panel an icon that lets you raise a hand. If for some reason you can't find that icon, you can type a question in the chat panel. And if that doesn't work, you can type an email to me with your question. You should have my email in the registration. If you're in an AV hub and you can't figure out how to raise your hand, you can physically raise your hand, wave it wildly, and I'll be able to see you while I'm monitoring the video. And we will control the muting and unmuting from here. Please, just for feedback and for to minimise chaos, please don't unmute yourselves. We will do that for you. And during the question time, my colleague Lucy Jacob will be facilitating that, and I'll be looking at the laptop. So this is the last time you'll see me today. Lovely to have you all here, and without further ado, I'd like you to make Lisa Ellis at Otago University welcome.
Are we muted as well? She's
Sorry, that wasn't the last time you're seeing me. University of Otago, we have you unmuted on our system here, and we could hear you about 5 minutes ago, so I wonder what's happening.
How is that?
Yay.
Oh, fantastic. So, sorry guys, I'm going to start over. We don't have much time, and this topic is inherently interesting. What I'm going to do is present the conclusions that my team came to about the ethics of climate adaptation. You would be perfectly within your rights to wonder why we think these things are true. And I am really happy to talk about that, but I'm putting that off to Q&A because of lack of time. I'm also happy to talk about more examples in Q&A if you like. So responding to things like sea level rise is scary. Time I listened to Kat about this way a little bit, Frank, doesn't matter which number you use, if you're talking 19 billion, if you're talking 32 billion, the scale of change that we're facing is of course really daunting. We can worry about how we're going to manage retreat at a place like Matata. That's a few dozen properties. And of course, we're looking at many tens of thousands of properties and many airports and lots of infrastructure and many people's inherently valuable communities. And all of this can be really scary. And what I want to do is have everybody for the next half hour at least shelve that fear and think about climate adaptation as an opportunity. The co-benefits of adaptation are not just a talking point. The co-benefits are substantial and society-wide. And I think we should look at this as an opportunity to realize what's best in us as a society. Another opportunity is that there is no settled international best practice for climate adaptation. And New Zealand is far ahead of the game, certainly imperfect, but far ahead of the game when it comes to things like community consultation. I wanted to share with you a screenshot from another Deep South Challenge project, this one directed by Johannes Smith, which really demonstrates, if you go to the website and look at it, you can see that co-benefits is not just a talking point. They are doing amazing things in Horowhenua, down on the coast, thinking about transitioning from dairy, thinking about changing residential patterns, and including artists and students and community members and scientists all together to visualize how to make things better over the short, medium, and long run. So let's think of this as an opportunity. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about scary things, and then I'm going to talk about happy things. Business as usual, if you don't already realize, that's right now a little scary. So let me just take a couple of seconds to talk about our method. We are philosophers. We're interested in applied ethics and critical description. What that means is we ask questions about how our institutions order our relationships with each other. And we ask, do our institutions realize our values? So philosophers look at social practices just as tools to arrange our interactions with each other. And things like money, things like markets, things like political institutions, things like social norms, all of those are just tools for us to try to put each other on a fair footing, to arrange our interactions. And what we want to know is, in the face of change, like sea level rise, how are our institutions responding? Are they ordering our interactions in a way that represents our settled values? So obviously, it's a controversial question. What are our settled values? One of the things I'll talk about later is the structural trade-off between values of solidarity in the face of natural hazard and the value of minimizing moral hazard when you're asking people to make investment decisions. So there's no sort of set of right answers for values. But there are some rules of thumb that can let us know whether we're moving toward or away from what we consider to be our best social practice. We tend to think it's important for people to have a fair go, and we gloss that as the value of equality. We tend to think it's important that people have a say in the outcomes that affect them, and we gloss that as the value of agency. And we tend to want the most collective well-being we can get. And we gloss that as utility. Okay, so when we're looking at how sea level rise affects the institutional realization of our social values, there are really a couple of big patterns. The first part of these patterns is there's risky new development. And if you go out and talk to people about sea level rise, they will complain. They say, I'm driving past the coast every day and I see these really expensive new developments going up, and I think to myself, am I going to be asked to compensate these developers when sea level rise erodes their foundations? People are worried that risky new development interferes with their fair interactions with each other. So that's one kind of risk associated with sea level rise. Then you have a whole nother set of ethical threats arising from how we deal with existing development that is increasingly at risk. And one of the biggest ethical problems that we face with that is that we're worried that people are not going to have a say in the policies that affect them. So if you go out and talk to ordinary people about this aspect of sea level rise, many people will say, what I'm worried about is some expert from Auckland is going to show up and tell us that we have to move. Clearly, this would not vindicate our consensus value of having a say in the policies that affect you. So we need to worry about that. And then for all kinds of sea level rise risk, we have this problem of unintended collective outcomes where if we don't take action now, we're all going to be worse off later. So there's some, when we're philosophers looking at critical descriptions of the status quo, there are some ways to describe business as usual that we think might be, in some cases, physically, socially accurate, but they do not resonate with our settled ethical values. So one thing that is sort of a global norm in applied ethics is that all things being equal, it's better not to transfer risk to the most vulnerable. It would be better if people more capable of handling social risk were the ones that handled it. And you could look at the changes that are happening with sea level rise and worry that what's happening right now is an ongoing transfer of risk to the most vulnerable. So for example, people who are not born yet are pretty vulnerable. They can't represent their own interests. And if you go out and talk to people, they will worry that if they had a conversation with their great-grandchildren, the great-grandchildren are going to ask them, why did you transfer this burden to us? This is something that everyone I've talked to is worried about, and we have an opportunity, I think, to take serious steps to address this worry that everybody now has. So we're worried about intergenerational inequity. But there's also a worry about inequity within the current living generation. We worry that we're going to transfer the burden of compensation to, for example, the general taxpayer, when those who benefit will only be patchily benefiting. We also have worry about being singled out. So, for example, if you happen to live in a place where your local government representatives are more forward-thinking, you might ask yourself, why do I have to put a hazard value on my limb and somebody living down the road doesn't have to do that? So we're worried about inequality, and we want to address this in our policies. Another really worrying possible gloss of business as usual is that we have a gap in the rule of law such that it's not even possible for us to deal fairly with each other. The most extreme example of this is the situation between investors in risky coastal properties and the public. Right? New Zealand has a really admirable tradition of solidarity with regard to people who face natural hazards. And we also have maybe a more common but slightly less admirable tradition of responding to well-organized groups with public policy. This makes it a pretty reasonable bet for people to add value to risky coastal property in the expectation that the public will cover their risk. And this is not a fair, the relationship that the investor has with the public in that case would not correspond to our settled ethical values. If you look at a place like the United States, you'll see that these glosses apply generally. So a place like Dauphin Island in Alabama, they have repeated flood events. The federal government subsidizes insurance. You could have 2, 3, even 7 rebuilds subsidized by the taxpayers with more property value every time. The gain in property value accrues to the people who own second homes on Dauphin Island, and the risk is transferred to the public. This is not something that conforms to ethical values. Unfortunately, that's not a New Zealand example. Okay, a couple of more glosses of business as usual, and then we will get to the happy stories, which there are many. Okay, so it's possible that we could worry that if we continue with business as usual, the phrase that will describe our sea level rise policy is the rich get seawalls and the poor get moved. I've been talking about this to New Zealanders for a year now. I haven't met anybody who endorses that outcome. The problem is that if you measure the value that the state wants to protect with a simple market value rather than recognizing social cultural value, this is the outcome you get. So again, using a really extreme example from the United States, you have the consequences of Hurricane Katrina, where the city of New Orleans is now richer and whiter, and you're much more likely to be dispersed from your community if you're poor and black. You contrast that with the example I just gave you of Dauphin Island, a second home community in Alabama, where no matter what happens naturally, people get to come back. This isn't an outcome that New Zealanders would endorse. And the final sort of scary descriptor before I get on to happier news is that people really do worry about having a lack of say-so in the future of their community. The conventional consultation we use tends to amplify the voices of the privileged. Right? If you offer a community meeting on Friday at noon and you distribute the invitation via the physical newspaper, who do you think is going to show up? Right? We need to do active efforts to broaden the groups of people who have a say-so in the future of their community, so that we don't amplify the voices of the privileged, but we in fact represent not only young people and renters, but also the future. Okay, so from here on out, we really do have the prospects of realizing the opportunities that come with making new climate adaptation policy, rather than just instantiating business as usual. I'm sure we can do better than that. So let's talk about the opportunities. As I said before, there is no philosophical workaround to the trade-off between solidarity and minimizing moral hazard. Different countries have made different decisions about what they think is the right answer to this trade-off. Right? The more solidaristic your response, the more tempting it is to pile up privatized assets with the hope that you can make your risks publicly covered. And that is, I hope some genius can solve this problem, but so far nobody has. Fortunately, there are ways for us to minimize the other costs around these decisions that we have to make. There are lots of ways to avoid the harms that come with these trade-offs. The number one thing we need is clearly regulatory certainty. If I know that my hazards will be listed on my limb and everybody's limb so that I don't feel singled out. If I know exactly how the city is planning for short, medium, and long-term hazards, and I know the different pathways the city is considering taking based on the uncertain prospects of natural change. If I know that new builds in a risky area will only be covered after a certain year. If I know what the compensation regime at the local and central level is. All of these elements of certainty make it possible for me to deal fairly with my fellow citizens. I'm no longer trying to free ride on the public. I'm just engaging on a fair basis with everybody else. One of the best institutional proposals to make this real comes from Jonathan Boston and Judy Lawrence in a paper they wrote on pre-funding climate adaptation. And I recommend that paper to everybody. It's available on the Vic Policy School website. But you don't have to wait for a big EQC-like central government funded mechanism to start thinking about mitigating these potential intergenerational wrongs. And in fact, right now in Hawke's Bay, they're talking about how can we pre-fund adaptation in response to a community consultation effort. And they're talking about how we can make it possible for people to face their grandchildren and say, we have made an effort not to transfer this burden to you. It's harder to work independently of central government, and we can certainly hope that there's more than the good guidance we've already received, but it is possible to move forward already. It would be great if we could use the polluter pay principle for sea level rise adaptation. That has a sort of whiff of fairness that almost everyone on Earth can recognize. You know, you broke it, you fix it. It's really appealing. Unfortunately, the people who put us in this position are either far beyond our reach from here in New Zealand, or they're dead. So we can't have the polluter pays principle. We have to go for the next best one. And we think this is that the beneficiaries share the costs. So we have to treat climate change as nature. We have this proposal to have a central EQC-like entity, but there are lots of other things we can do. For my money, the Boston and Lawrence proposal talks about an EQC-like entity that's funded by the taxpayers. If you asked me, invent this institution tomorrow, I would propose a more targeted funding source, something that had positive externalities, something like a carbon charge. But I know as soon as you hear those last couple of words, you're thinking, oh, this is really a philosopher. So let's go on to something more realistic. If you want to identify beneficiaries, you can think about the provision of public goods every time we proactively rather than reactively. We are providing a public good. If we're maintaining accessible beaches, that's a public good. If we're making sure that property is safe, that's a public good. So property owners benefit from that, but so does the wider public. The people who are responsible for infrastructure benefit from that, and that's central, regional, local government, as well as private holders of infrastructure. So it's not that hard to identify beneficiaries. Now, you remember that I said before, social practices, including money and regulation, these are just ways to regulate our interaction. I think this is why including externalities in our who pays calculation is really important. If you think of the example I talked about earlier with Johannes Smith and the iwi in Horowhenua, right? They are thinking as a small community already about how to adapt on their own dime to sea level rise and climate change by altering their economic decisions. And there are other people who are reacting to uncertainty by piling risky investments onto the coast. And it might be a good idea when we're thinking about who pays and who benefits to think about rewarding pro-social behavior like Johannes Smith has documented in Horowhenua, and to think about making it more expensive to do things like put up temporary seawalls. Okay, now I want to move on to, is it fair? It's really encouraging that so many councils and localities in New Zealand right now are improving their engagement practices. We're not using this top-down public education model. We're progressing beyond box-ticking style consultation that has well-documented short-run and long-run negative effects, not only for fairness, but for practically rolling out your policies. There's lots of reasons to move toward more serious, more egalitarian engagement. Now, and I think the guidelines distributed by MFE and the process that they used in Hawke's Bay are the beginnings of really good models. But there are a couple of things that I think we should do to tweak them to make them even better, such that we can be proud to offer the New Zealand model to the whole world. So the first of these, I think we need to do active recruitment of underrepresented groups. Young people are not going to show up to midday meetings advertised in the newspaper. Renters often are underrepresented because they don't recognize the stake they have. And we need to do not just, oh, they didn't show up, but actual active recruitment. The citizen jury model is a good way to think of it, especially because we recognize that people have opportunity costs when they commit to a year-long consultation process. So we can do better, I think, representing underrepresented groups. And finally, the second tweak I think we should make to the existing consultation practices is we need to build in a moment where we ask ourselves, is this outcome consistent with our settled ethical values? If you divide up decision-making into a lot of local, regional processes, you're going to do really well at vindicating the value of agency, at getting people to have a say in the policies that affect them. But if there is no moment where people have to think of the collective results of a bunch of disconnected, uncoordinated local processes, you could end up with a result that nobody wants. One of the participants in the Hawke's Bay process realized this at the very end and had a sort of moment thinking, well, really, perhaps what we should have done is everybody used a more natural solution. But of course, that didn't resonate with the consultation processes vindicated values. They were really looking more at a series of engineering solutions, sometimes eventually resulting in managed retreat, but overwhelmingly ending up with things like engineering solutions like seawalls. That represented what local people wanted. But I think if you ask the people of Hawke's Bay, do we will to eliminate accessible beaches? The answer would be no. So the two tweaks I would make to the existing consultation practices are, in the first place, I think we need active recruitment of underrepresented groups. And in the second place, I think we need moments where we consider, have we got an outcome that we, in fact, endorse? And I think both of those are perfectly doable. Thank you. I'm done now. We can have questions, or we can talk to Catherine. Oh, there's complete silence.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Lisa. You ended well before your 30 minutes was up, so that's great. We thought we would roll straight into your presentation and then do the questions at the end. So if you're ready, Catherine, we'll just make sure that we're sharing our screen. Yeah. Lisa, have you stopped sharing? Thank you. There's also water for you there if you want it. Okay, brilliant. So, yep, we now have Catherine Iorns, who's going to continue on from there. Thank you.
Kia ora tātou, and thanks for that, Lucy. I've been asked to look at who pays. And so the answer to that, so maybe I should say, so I teach law here at Victoria University. So I'm looking at it from the legal angle. So who's pays? So that we're always going to say, as a lawyer, the answer is it depends, right? It depends on what the law says. It depends on the words that were used. It depends on whether judges have had a say on what they think those words use. It depends on whether that has changed over time. Sometimes the social situation changes such that even an interpretation that was made, say, and I think a classic example for us is an interpretation that was made in 2010 under the old New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement. The same interpretation might have a very different result now as to whether that same person might pay and to whether we're going to have the same result in law and then on facts on the ground. So in terms of this research project for Deep South, I've been asked to address who is liable for damage to housing and climate adaptation measures from sea level rise. And I'm not quite sure, you're trying to get me up.
I was trying to get you up.
Okay, so I don't know if they thought that was a simple question, but I've certainly made it complex. So there's another researcher, Vanessa James and myself, who've put together a program to look at this. And so far we've divided it into 4, and we sort of did this at the beginning and we didn't really think about the size of the different 4, and they're all completely different sizes in terms of these 4 parts. And we started off small and it just got bigger. So I just thought I'd outline what some of the work that we've done in terms of coverage without really talking about the findings. We've got draft reports on all of them, and they have been sent out to various different people. And one of them, as an example, which I'll mention, I've already decided I don't want to cover half of it, and we're going to slash the draft report and change, and not have so many sort of recommendations, and we're just going to make findings about what we think what is, not what should be. But so there's just an example. Over the couple of years, it's sort of changed what we look at. But there will be, final published reports coming out on that in the next couple of months. Certainly, I think before our big conference in May. So the first one, what do we look at? And I had so I've got some summer scholars at the moment, and one of the, very helpfully just this morning, I thought, oh, maybe we should have some slides on this. So I've put up, but it doesn't come out very clearly, I'm sorry. So I'm more than happy, I've got my email address there, I'm more than happy to send people some summaries. But I said the first one, it's not, I'm pushing an arrow button, nothing's moving, but that's okay. So I can talk about it. The first one is on case studies on what's happened in some other situations overseas, particularly in relation to flooding, and some flooding that's not sea level rise, but what are other countries doing in relation to some of these disaster events, but also sea level rise. And of course, when you say flooding from sea level rise, it's not just slow flooding, it's mostly big storm events that have a greater effect, than they used to. So it's often storms and sudden adverse effects and damage. So what are some of these case studies that we've looked at overseas? Also some disasters in New Zealand. I mean, like the Leaky Home saga, what has happened as a result of that? I was going to give an overview and then talk about each one. And so that was the focus of our first report. The second one, government responsibility under EQC. What are some of the areas that would be relevant to sea level rise and damage from sea level rise, flooding, and other sort of cases of inundation there. The third one, local government adaptation measures under the RMA. So that's of course become the largest one. I was going to say probably 4 times the size of the first one on case studies. We've got at least 250 pages on that one. And then central government responsibility finally under the Treaty of Waitangi. That's something that not many people focus on as an issue of liability. All right, but, and you could say technically, most of the liability issues under the treaty have been by choice from the government. They decide it's a moral choice that they want to uphold the treaty. You can't take the treaty to court, or they've made an act, the Treaty of Waitangi Act, which says that you can take a claim to the tribunal, but the government doesn't have to follow the recommendations of that. So it's a choice, a political and moral choice of government to decide where responsibility lies. But nevertheless, we have a lot of law and other principles about what the treaty says the government needs to be doing. And so if local government in their climate adaptation measures doesn't uphold the treaty or creates results, say, in their measures and their processes, that end up violating treaty principles, they may put a responsibility on central government, right, further down the line. So I think that's really important to look at, mainly because nobody else is, and that's certainly the most recent focus and the fourth of our reports. And that one's not actually, I haven't actually sent that places yet, but anyway. So what have some of the things, some of these, I don't want to, Ian, we don't want to talk too much about sort of findings and results, but when you're just talking about what does the law say on some things, if we're not recommending measures for reform, it's not so hard to say what findings are. But I thought the case studies one is really interesting, and Lisa Ellis particularly mentioned some case studies, and you see, certainly when you look overseas, you see some things not to do, and some of the examples in the States have got some great ones of what not to do. The federal flood reinsurance program, which Lisa talked about. We see in the UK with the flood re example some really interesting, I guess a really interesting whole policy and then legal structure around state encouragement and then also sponsorship of insurance around flooding. And that is actually a really, could be a really useful example for some of the things that we could do here. We see when we look at the Leaky Home saga and the Christchurch earthquake rebuild, we see that there will be an assumption, as Lisa talked about, there will be an assumption that the government steps in. All right, and it's simple as, that may not be a law, there may not be a law about liability for that, but we have to put it in the back of our minds that someone probably will devise a law around liability, and there'll be a whole system set up like for leaky homes. You know, it's possible, where you're going to have time limits and you're going to have thresholds and who can cover and what's covered, and those kind of things are going to have to be decided, and you just look at some of these other examples and you think, actually, we're going to need to put in place a whole set of things like that. But it's not my job right now to say what we should be putting in place. It's more to identify these, look at the issues that came up under these ones, certainly the legal issues about liability. Look what's happened in these other places. So there's just one report on looking at some of those. So I won't say more about it because there's so many more about the other ones. The EQC report, we did that second, and again, this was nearly a year ago, but then we just kind of moved on to the next reports. And the EQC one I think is a really interesting one, if only because a lot of people see EQC as the social insurance backdrop. It's like a safety net. And so there've been a lot of suggestions for that there should be coverage from EQC from people. So we looked at what is covered. And of course, for climate change, what is covered, sea level damage from flooding events due to sea level rise, or i.e. coastal inundation and events that are associated with that. Only damage to land is covered under EQC, not buildings, and we just also not contents. They weren't anyway, but we've also got that new law change that came through last week, to remove content cover anyway. So it's a very limited damage, land damage, because buildings and other things are covered at the moment by private insurance. So it really is that backdrop. But what constitutes a storm, flood, or landslip? We've said a landslip under the scheme. We've said that's unclear because it's not defined in the legislation. Now, others say it's very clear because the courts have made a pronouncement on what it says. But that could change over time. Right, so we still hold that, well, yes, courts have defined these terms, but not in legislation, and you won't know what's covered just by looking at the Act. The general public won't know what's covered. So I think there is some room for clarity around some of these things and room for amendment, but we're more just describing what is. We've got a sort of a list of at least 10 findings about coverage under the Act, which I'm more than happy to be sharing. Certainly soon when this is released. But I think that's the key one for that. Under the local government one, that's where most of the work has been done. I know there's a little bit of overlap with some of the other work being done in the country around resilience. Right, what kinds of things can councils do when a council is going to be liable for that information on that they might want to put in their limbs? When are they going to be allowed to put it on, and what are the conditions? When are they going to be made to put it on? All right, there's what mechanisms can be used to enable managed retreat, and when is a government going to be made to pay somebody out, and when is it going to be liable for not doing something? When you get some big flood, say, damage, and when is a council particularly going to be liable for, say, negligence in this area? So we've been looking at those kind of things. But when are their duties to establish coastal protection works, and when are you not allowed to establish coastal protection work? And the biggest thing we find in some of these is that the law changes. Right, the cases from 2010, which might establish the law and the rules, well, some of them are not good, because we've got new coastal policy statement, we've got new guidance from Department of Conservation and the Ministry for the Environment. But the cases haven't been taken in law to find out what judges say those new rules are. Right, so one of my summer scholars is working on that, taking some of the old cases, it's really fun, taking some of the old cases and saying, what would they be under the new guidance and the new laws? Would we get the same result, or would they be different? And so that's going to be something else. They're not in the reports yet. That'll be another thing that'll come out of this project. So yes, we have lots of answers on what we think the law is and the liability is in these areas, and that's so far 250 pages. A little bit long, but no, a lot of it's background for those, because we know there's a lot of scientists and others who don't know the Resource Management Act. So half of it is background to what are the rules before we then apply it to this area of sea level rise and climate adaptation. And then finally, the Treaty of Waitangi topic. There are a lot of duties of active protection on the government to actively protect Māori Article 2 assets. All their taonga, lands, estates, forests, fisheries, and other taonga. All right, there's a duty of active protection. You can't just, and so that suggests that you can't just, if there are things that we could be doing, we can't just leave it and say, oh, the sea did it. All right, it's actually could be a government policy that let that go. So there are issues there around not creating future treaty claims. There's also then the methods that the process of making decisions on climate adaptation. The Resource Management Act has got a process that has a lot of Māori participation. It's got some standards about protection of Māori assets, but the Waitangi Tribunal has already held that the Resource Management Act does not uphold the treaty standards. Okay, so the Resource Management Act itself is in breach of the treaty in some areas. Okay, so councils, simply by complying with the Resource Management Act, may still be creating further treaty breaches down the line. Right, so that I think is the biggest worry in terms of just forging ahead with some of the adaptation measures, certainly leaving people to be doing things ad hoc at the moment, without an letting one council do this and one council do that, and you might have a good process here and a bad process there. So this process that could be in breach of the partnership, right? But you also have then the substantive results, which could be against active protection. Right? So I think that's an area for huge work, a lot more work, and we're going to put out a background paper on just some, so what the rules are, what are the treaty what are the duties, and then what are some of the things that council are going to be doing and where they have to be careful about breaching these duties, and then some case studies, some examples of where these things come up. And we've looked at a lot of the government guidance to say, what are the provisions on Māori, and do they look like do they go far enough to meet the treaty duties? Or do even the guidance that has come out, Parliamentary Question Environment, the Ministry of the Environment one, and the Department of Conservation one. So yeah, do they go far enough, and do they need to do more? I think that's certainly at least 10 minutes. I know I haven't timed it, but that's a summary of my work, and I'm more than happy to take questions on that. Thank you, and kia ora tātou.
Okay, so thank you very much to both of our speakers. This is a really interesting topic, and we've already got a few questions coming in. So I'm going to forge ahead with the first questions, but if anybody, just a quick reminder, if you do have a question, if you could raise your hand on Zoom, if you have access to the computer, then Alex will see it, or physically wave your hand if you're here or if you're in another room, and then we'll try and come to you in order. Okay, so first of all, we had a question from Matthew DeBoer, and this is to everyone. Oh, no, it's not, sorry, it was in the chat to everyone, but I think it's to Lisa. How do we engage with future generations when they don't exist yet?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, super. Thanks. That's a great question. You'll notice I didn't mention it in my presentation. But there are a sort of range of ways where it is possible to respect the interests of future generations and also non-human participants. So for example, in the Hawke's Bay process, at the stage where they asked local people how they were going to weight different values in a multi-criteria decision analysis, the local people had the option of rating non-human species environmental values highly or medium or low. And for the most part, they chose to ignore them. But they did have the opportunity to consider the interests of non-human well-being. In my view, one of the most powerful, really basic institutions for vindicating the interests of the non-represented is explicit principled defense. I know that sounds really weak. What I'm essentially saying, you have to say what the implications of your policy are out loud. But I do think that that has a constraining effect. So if you have a policy, let's say I want to build a seawall and it's going to protect my property, but it means my neighbors won't have access to the beach that used to be in front of my house. I should have to say that this is what I'm willing. And I think that has a constraining effect if we have to say what the effect on our grandchildren and great-grandchildren and non-humans will be. So that's one suggestion. New Zealand has another model which I think is really interesting and promising, and I had a student, Britta Clark, working on it, who worked with Catherine a little bit, actually. And this is the legal personhood model. So I'm not an expert on legal personhood, but one of the things that this institution does is explicitly represent conventionally unrepresentable views. And then in the global literature, there are a bunch of suggestions. You can have represented guardians. You can have parliaments of non-humans. You can have parliaments of the future. There are many institutional ways to get those voices heard. Thanks for that good question.
Great, thanks for that great answer, Lisa. I can see hands going up everywhere. There's a question from Claire Steele. This is a bit of a technical one, and it's to either Lisa or Catherine. With reference to the vulnerability assessments, step 4 in the MFE guidance, are you required to include results of vulnerable areas in LIMS as S44A or of LGOIMA? Does that mean anything to you, Lisa? And are you able to answer that question? Or to Catherine? If not, perhaps you can do it via email afterwards.
I think it's an interesting question. I can say both yes and no. So no, I can't answer the question. But yes, I think it's really important to think about the way that that 10-step guidance works. I don't think it has been worked out yet what all of the implications of the 10 steps are. So for example, in the engagement steps, there's a lot of talk of engaging underrepresented groups, but no specific mechanisms envisioned. And I wouldn't be surprised if it was just as vague at 4 point whatever it was. But that's all I have on that question.
Okay, thank you. I've got a final question here that came in during the presentations. Then I've seen a few hands raised in this room, and then perhaps we'll move around to some of the other rooms. So this is from Rob Bell for Lisa again. What steps are needed to establish national legitimacy and fairness to managed retreat option, but still retain some local creativity? Otherwise, we have unmanaged retreat.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it contains its answer. I'll say what I have to say. I wouldn't be surprised if Catherine also has something to say on this. So first of all, just like I said, there's a structural trade-off between solidarity and minimizing moral hazard. Similarly, there's a structural trade-off between respecting existing people's moral time frame and respecting the interests of the future. So remember when I said a lot of people are worried that an expert from Auckland is going to show up and tell them they have to move? From the perspective of the expert from Auckland, he represents the future. And he also represents, broadly speaking, collective well-being measured in a very utilitarian way. The problem with the expert from Auckland showing up and telling you have to move is that local people have every right to discount the future. They just need to be explicit about it. After all, the future is very uncertain. In my report, there are lots of examples of people who rightly feel hard done by when they're expected to shoulder the whole burden of generations of climate change damage. So there must be a way to balance local people's right to think in the short and medium term and to discount the future given the uncertainty of it, and the interests of future people in not having a degraded inheritance. I think the way to do that is, one, to include socio-cultural value in any kind of calculations you're making, and two, have really engaged processes that also have this moment of collective consideration that I recommended at the end of my talk. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. We've got a few questions from the room here at Victoria University. So we're just passing the mic around. I'll try and turn the camera around, but this is a bit tricky.
Kia ora tātou. My name's Janie Walker. I'm just finishing my master's at Victoria in development studies. I've been looking at whether local voices are informing climate change adaptation policy in Fiji in the Pacific. And I'd now like to contribute to New Zealand's National Adaptation Plan. And my question is, from a values and ethical perspective, what do you want to kind of scream and shout about with New Zealand's National Adaptation Plan? Yeah.
We have a National Adaptation Plan? I wasn't aware of that.
Oh, we're very early stages in the scoping process. Was that a joke?
Yeah, no, I was joking. I think the Fiji case is actually really interesting. I think a lot of people don't realize that in the Pacific, there are people living in the Pacific who have gone through 2 different relocations already. And the circumstances of their relocations, as you know, and maybe everybody else ought to think about, are very far from the ethical norms that we're working toward here, and I'm far from the ethical norms I bet you discovered there. So, for example, the state is often absent, and the relocations are often just at the grace of local, they're basically based on local guest friendship and personal private ties, sometimes as formal as chief to chief, and sometimes not even that good. And the human catastrophe of that kind of relocation should focus all of our minds on doing really well for our own forward-thinking adaptation planning. But in terms of what I want to scream from the rooftops, Janie, it's really just those 2 things I mentioned, that we need to represent the underrepresented, and that we need to think both about the local and the collective outcomes. I can't wait to read your work. Is it out there?
I'll see you after Monday when I hand in.
Send it to me when it's ready.
Great, thanks for that. So if you'd like to introduce yourself and then ask your question, that would be great, thanks.
Oh, kia ora, Beth-Ann Martin, also philosopher and ethics person, but Catherine, this is really for you, and rather precisely like your question of what does the law say. So what are you expecting with the Zero Carbon Act? And I mean, I know none of us know exactly what's in it, but how does that, do you think it's going to relate to these issues, or is it simply about reducing carbon? I can see Jonathan shaking his head. Maybe you'd rather answer. But, you know, if the RMA is not adequate, how are we going to get adequate law?
Okay, so I prefer that question to what's in the Zero Carbon Act. Mainly the Zero Carbon Act is not designed to do with adaptation at all. It really is designed to reduce our emissions. And we've got to decide what we're going to do then about the results of too much carbon. That's a completely separate question. But I'd like your other question of what can we do if the RMA might not enable. So one thing, there's a lot that can be done in the RMA, though obviously not everything. But there's a really interesting thing. Some of the more interesting things that have happened recently have not simply followed RMA processes. And we have the Clifton to Tangoio process in the Hawke's Bay that's been outside the RMA, even though it's been driven by these councils, but they set up a different body that's not literally following Schedule 2 plan process changes, right? We've also got the sea change process in the Hauraki Gulf, where they've done the marine spatial planning. That's they're just local government act processes where they get the community together and they get the stakeholders. You know, when I say the community, they get lots of different stakeholders within the community to decide what they want to happen. Now, those are local examples. There are things that can be done, but obviously what we need to do in order to solve these, to give guidance, but solve the problems and give some certainty on a national scale is to get national guidance. So we do need an adaptation plan, but it's not just that. As Jonathan's been working on funding, we need the funding side of things, but we need all of those ethics about who's going to decide. We need the decision-making bodies, whether it's a future commission for some of these areas. You know, there's also lots of different people working on lots of different bits, and it does need just to be brought together to decide what the rules should be and then implement them. So it's not a quick process. Unfortunately, some of these things are happening now before we get the rules sorted and before we get the process sorted. That's really the hard thing. So we're going to have to do Matata and Homoana and all those other, you know, the West Coast. Is it Tana Hector? Was it having a problem with their seawalls as well? You know, not everyone, but there's lots of places around the country in that situation. And unfortunately, they're going to have to do it before we have a national adaptation plan, as we've been talking about. And so maybe what we need to do is use the ones we've got. So hence seeing what the rules are. Hence my paper, it's going to be on what are some of the rules that we know exist, what are some of the limitations, and then let's see what can we do to be creative to enable a better result so we don't get the ethical and moral dilemmas that Lisa's pointed out, and we can solve some of those problems in advance and not suffer their consequences, I think.
Great, thanks, Catherine. We've got 5 minutes left, and we've got at least 2 questions I know of, so we'll move straight over to you. If you could please introduce yourself for those that
Kia ora, Jonathan Boston, Victoria University, and Lisa, thanks for noting our paper and your paper, and thank you for your really excellent presentation. I'd just really like to make a few quick comments. The first is, if we're talking about who pays, we have to add the next bit, who pays for what, because there's going to be different principles that will apply depending on the what. So whether it's loss of residential property or land vis-a-vis paying for seawalls or other hard structures or whatever. Secondly, just to really probably reinforce what Catherine was saying, legal principles, doctrines, precedents, and so on are going to be vital in this process, and we can't ignore them. And I think, Lisa, in terms of your work, and I'd say my work, we need to recognise that this stuff's really important, and of course legal precedents and so on reflect values, and as Catherine said, those may change over time, of course. Third point, quick point, consistency. I think we should be seeking to design frameworks that are going to be nationally consistent, because that appeals to the solidaristic sort of principle and egalitarianism, which are important in New Zealand. And we also, I think, need to try and be consistent over time. So we have intertemporal as well as intragenerational consistency. And finally, the principle of remedial responsibility. Lisa, one of the reasons Judy and I have suggested that in the end, taxpayers are going to have to foot the bill, or a lot of the bill for a lot of what has to be done, is because ultimately only taxpayers or the national government is going to have the resources available for the scale of the challenge that we face. There's no other entity. And I think in that context, the principle that the state, in this case central government, has an ultimate remedial responsibility to act is a critical principle in the overall scheme of things. There's an awful lot more in this, and lots of further discussions to be had, but thank you both for your great work.
Okay, thank you very much for those comments. I think we did have a question from the University of Otago, and it would be our last question. So if that question is still there, you're unmuted, so please feel free to ask it.
Yes, so I'm Maria Wanu from Dunedin City Council, and I guess my question to both presenters is the question right? Because I feel like this question of who pays is in a very kind of current status quo way of looking at the world. And we are looking in Dunedin at dealing with people who do not own homes, who will not be looked at as people to compensate. And I guess the same applies to young people and future generations. And I feel like this whole conversation about compensation just doesn't quite ring true to me. I think it's more of a conversation about how can we pay for what we need to achieve, rather than this who pays.
Right, that sounds like an excellent.
Shall I start and then move to Catherine? Maria, that is a really great question. I think especially if we focus on the legal status quo, I actually agree with a lot of what Jonathan just said, and I'm really happy for those comments, but I don't agree that the legal status quo reflects our settled ethical values, because the legal status quo views the last dollar of your third beach house as the same kind of harm as the first dollar of the house you live in. And I think there's a really serious moral difference there. I think one of the ways we can adapt to that is by valuing socio-cultural value along with traditional market value when we make these calculations, but that's only a beginning to something that you're right, it has to be a different kind of conversation. I'm throwing it to Catherine.
Oh, sorry, I didn't realize it was turned around. Okay, so I'm just standing by the microphone here with the camera. So I agree completely. And our particular stakeholder dialogue for this one was an insurance sector dialogue. So it asked questions about insurance and payments for damage to housing only. That's all it was. That's all of the. It was a closed RFP designed by from a particular dialogue. we've made that wider and looked at, like, for example, the council adaptation measures and other wider issues, the treaty liability, solely because that first question of who pays is not enough. But it's a good, it was just simply a snappy shorthand to advertise, you know, something like this, but we're not limited to that in our assessment of our work. So I can say that. So I hope that makes you feel a bit better about it.
Great. Well, I'd just like to thank our two speakers very much for that wonderful presentation and all the work that's gone in behind the scenes. I think it's obviously a really popular topic because it's just so relevant to the current time, as we know that government are working through various things. So thank you for coming along, and we hope to see you at the next Deep South Challenge seminar, which won't be for a while because we're now ramping up to our conference that's happening in May. So if you would like to know more about the conference, then send us an email or have a look on our website. We do have some further details about it. Thank you very much, everyone.